What's up and welcome to another episode of Gizmo Slip Tech. Today we're talking Starfield performance. We're doing split screen benchmarks with both FSR, different render resolutions, low settings versus high settings, RTX 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90 gaming laptops all being compared in split screen comparisons. We're going to talk about what kind of performance you can get with the DLSS frame generation mod and how much it actually improves performance, and it's kind of crazy how much performance it improves. And then we're also going to go over how to install the frame generation mod. It only takes like 2 minutes to install and almost doubles your FPS. Almost. It all depends on your settings and what you're doing in the game, but it's pretty insane. It's very, very much insane. But before we move on to the insanity, a quick word from our sponsor. Now I got to give a huge shout out and thank you to Best Buy for sponsoring this episode. They sent over some awesome products for me to check out and use in today's video. You can see I'm using the Stream Deck right now. This is a stream controller that allows you to switch different stream scenes or volume or brightness or whatever you want right here on a tactile interface that you can visually see apart from your main screen. So if you're gaming on your screen and you can't see what scene you're streaming, you can easily control your stream with this Elgato Stream Deck. So big shout out and thank you to Best Buy for sending this over, as well as the Zephyrus G14, which we also used in today's video. The Zephyrus G14, of course, is the AMD powered Ryzen 9 7940HS equipped gaming laptop. It's super portable, weighs less than 4 pounds. It's thin, it's light, it's got a vapor chamber, it's got an excellent glass trackpad, Windows Hello, 16:10 aspect ratio display, 500 nits brightness. I really love the Zephyrus G14, and I'm not just saying that because I can say whatever I want about these products. That's literally in the contract with my sponsorship with Best Buy. I will only ever take a sponsorship if I can be completely honest about the pros and cons of the device. Now, of course, the big downside for the Zephyrus G14 is that it does run a bit thermally hot. It is a very high-powered device considering its size. So I recommend using Armory Crate to tune the laptop to get the right temperatures and the right level of performance. And then you just got a nice portable, powerful package that you can take with you just about anywhere and play literally every single game out there with good settings. Now I'm gonna go ahead and press the face cam button on the Stream Deck and go back here. Yeah, check that out. Now I'm gonna press the browser window button on the Stream Deck. Hey, there's the browser window. Okay, cool. All right. So this is the Elgato Stream Deck. It is $200. And it lets you control your stream with tactile buttons that are LCD buttons, and you can change the icons here on the buttons themselves to be whatever you want. And then of course the Zephyrus G14 as well, which I have also reviewed, and we just basically give you my initial thoughts here. The Zephyrus G14, probably my favorite portable gaming laptop that I've tested in 2023. So if you're in the market for any kind of gaming product, streaming products, link in the description down below. They've got an excellent return policy. I have used the return policy a bunch of times. I've also used their black tie protection, and I am a Total Tech member, which gives me discounts, including the Stream Deck is $30 off if you're a Total Tech member, and it gives you discounts on all kinds of other stuff, and it automatically gives you a 2-year warranty if you just have that Total Tech protection. So I definitely also recommend that. Best Buy is constantly rotating the sales on their website, so be sure to go check it out on bestbuy.com. Link in the description down below. Without further ado, let's take a look at more Starfield benchmarks. Let's take a quick look at the laptops that we'll actually be benchmarking with. We'll start with the HP Omen 16 overview. This has an i5 CPU, 13420H, RTX 4050, 16 gigs, DDR5, 5200, 512 gig SSD, and a full HD 144 Hz display. This one's $899, and it has an RTX. So basically, starting with the cheapest laptop, can the cheapest laptop run it? Then we're gonna move up to the Zephyrus G14, has an RTX 4060 with a QHD display this time, and it's 16:10 QHD. And the rest of the laptops actually have the same resolution and same exact resolution, QHD plus, Full HD, 2560 by 1600. So the Zephyrus G14 has a Ryzen CPU, 8-core, 16-thread, Ryzen 9 7940HS. Of course, it's a thinner, smaller laptop. Then we have the Acer Nitro 16. And the Nitro 16 is one of the best bang for the buck RTX 4070 laptops that have ever been released so far. QHD 165Hz, 500 nits display on this. Ryzen 7 7735HS, so an 8-core 16-thread part. Again, 16 gigs of DDR5. And we'll see how well the 4070 handles it. Then we'll go up to the MSI GE78 with the i9-13950HX, RTX 4080, 32 gigs of RAM, 2TB SSD, and a QHD Plus 240 Hz 370 nits display. And this is basically MSI's flagship aside from the MSI GT77. This is their more premium flagship, where the GT77 is more their performance flagship, is what I would say. And then for the 4090 laptop, we'll be using the Asus Strix Scar 16 with the i9-13980HX, which is the best you can get. RTX 4090 with a full 175 watt capacity, 32 gigs of DDR5, 4800 RAM, 2TB SSD, and the QHD 1100 nits display. So those are the 5 laptops we're going to be testing today with Starfield. All right, so this first benchmark comparison is comparing FSR at 75% render resolution versus FSR at 100% render resolution. And you can see that it doesn't really give much performance gains, about 4 FPS increase by lowering that render resolution. It does help a little bit though, and it'll help even more if you go all the way down to 50%. But that's the lowest it'll go, and it really is not going to boost your FPS by too much. I think that's the main thing I'm trying to point out here is with FSR. It does help, but it doesn't help so much that it's like mind-blowing. Now, low settings on the left here versus high settings on the right. Keep in mind that my average here on the left is not going to be quite right, so just focus on these live numbers here. 43 FPS versus 30. This is with the Zephyrus G14 with an RTX 4060. Now, notice that the low settings really does help boost your FPS into a much more playable frame rate. And our 1% lows is actually better than this because it was the loading menu that was causing this. But 1% lows around 20 FPS in both instances on low settings or high settings definitely doesn't result in a super smooth playable gameplay. You know, only a little over 40 FPS. I estimated 42 average on low settings versus 30 on high settings or ultra settings. This is with 100% render resolution at QHD plus with a 4060. This is just not great playable numbers. That's for sure. Thank goodness there is DLSS mod support, which we're going to talk about soon. Not just yet, but we're going to do that in a bit here. So moving on. Lowering the resolution really boosts the FPS in Starfield. So on the left, we have the Full HD Plus 1920 by 1200 versus QHD and Full HD Plus on Ultra settings. Ultra settings with Full HD Plus still crushing that frame rate down to 35 FPS on average, whereas a low plus Full HD Plus giving us 51 FPS, 28 for a 1% lows, certainly a lot more playable and a lot more fluid, having our 1% lows be that much higher. Now, this was at 100% FSR resolution, so if you wanted to lower your render resolution now to 50% and run it on low and Full HD, you could probably push a little bit over 60 FPS with FSR. And we're gonna, yep, you're probably going to still want to use DLSS though if you have a RTX graphics card. So moving on, we're doing the Space Combat lowest settings. So low settings with Full HD Plus versus ultra settings in space. In space, we're only doing 40, 50, 60 F. So when you zoom in, I want to point out here, when you zoom in on the spacecraft, you get a huge boost in FPS. Because it has to render a lot less objects on your screen. So notice that once I lock in and zoom in on either screen, the FPS is going to completely change. But low settings with Full HD Plus giving us very playable 75, 40 for our 1% lows. Ultra settings getting 35 FPS with 31 for our 1% low. So we have very good 1% lows relative to the average, and it is smooth enough to actually play the game in space on ultra settings, but it's still not super fluid because it is not that high of an FPS. So still recommended to tweak the settings down, lower the render resolution, whatever. We have no dynamic resolution on any of these tests. So as we zoom in, we're getting a huge FPS boost to 89 versus and 54 right here. Yeah, low settings in space is super fluid on all of the graphics cards, RTX 4050, 60, 70, 80, and 90. So in space, way less demanding than when you're on the ground. Now here we have the RTX 4050 now versus the RTX 4060 here on the right. Ultra settings, 100% FSR render resolution. The only main difference here is that it's 1920 by 1080 on the HP Omen, because it's the natural resolution, native resolution of the Omen 16 versus 1920 by 1200, which is the 16 by 10 aspect resolution. So that said, the 16 by 10 aspect resolution of the G14 is about 10% more resolution. So factor that in when you're looking at these averages. The G14 right now averaging about 4 to 5 more FPS, although the 1% lows are actually better on the Omen with the Intel processor, which is kind of interesting that the Intel processor seems to have a bit better 1% lows versus all of the Ryzen chips in basically all of the tests in this game. Now, we're jumping down to low settings, 1920 by 1080. And again, just a slight difference in resolution, 4050 versus 4060. And we're getting very smooth playable frame rates on the Omen, 38 for our 1% lows. Intel doing a really good job getting our 1% lows up high enough to where 50 FPS actually feels very fluid because our 1% low is 38. 28 over here on the Ryzen CPU with the 4060. Still fluid enough to have enjoyable gameplay with 51 FPS and 28, but far from ideal on either system. Realistically, of course, if you were to throw DLSS frame engine in here, and it would be very good on both systems. So just keep that in mind. Now, moving into space, the RTX 4050 versus 4060. Low settings. Again, slight difference in resolution here when we're zoomed in on both of these systems. 96 FPS actually right now on the Omen. Omen doing a little bit more FPS, shockingly, than the Zephyrus G14. And the 1% low is again better on the Intel Omen 16. So very interesting, 75 FPS on average, 76, very similar averages between the Omen 16 and the Zephyrus G14. Very playable in space for both systems with very fluid gameplay. Next, we're moving on to the RTX 4060 comparison versus the RTX 4070 in the Nitro 16. These are low settings with QHD plus resolution, so 2560 by 1600. And interestingly enough, the Ryzen chip in the Nitro 16, again, doing a bit better here. 36 for our 1% lows, 23 for the Zephyrus G14. The average, though, is only slightly better on the Nitro 16. So, like, it's only a 4 FPS increase here on the 4070 versus the 4060. So not much to write home about. So do not pay extra or not much extra for a 4070 versus a 4060. And these CPUs are almost the same between the Ryzen 7s. Just one is Zen 3, one's Zen 4, but both 8-core 16-thread. So going to ultra settings, the RTX 4070 doing 4 FPS more than the 4060. Our 1% low is also 6 more than the on the Nitro 16s. 1% low is 6 more FPS here on ultra settings. That does translate into some more fluid gameplay for sure. Moving into space, the Zephyrus G14 doing 35 FPS on average, 31 for our 1% lows. And the 4070 doing much better here overall. Actually, not real. Now that I'm looking at, I was going to say it should be doing much better, but it's not really pushing that much higher FPS. Super interesting. 41. Let's see here. When we're both just looking at random place in space, without being zoomed in, 35 versus 43. This is probably the most realistic, more comparable benchmark right here. Just because when you zoom in on the spacecraft, it really does have a huge variance because there's so much less to render when you're zoomed in. So just keep in mind the averages are very skewed in space. So this is probably more accurate. 41 versus 35 here in space. Okay, moving on. Next up, we have the Nitro 16 versus the GE78, RTX 4070 versus 4080 with the i9. So we have an Intel i9 versus a Ryzen 7 as well being paired up. Ultra settings, QHD plus 35 FPS with 26 for a 1% low on the Nitro 16. 51 FPS to 33 for a 1% low on the 4080. So not only is the average better on the 4080, our 1% low on the 4080 basically matches the average of the 4070. This is going to translate to a far more dramatically better gameplay experience with ultra settings. So definitely recommend, especially if you're not going to use DLSS, then, if you're not a frame gen fan because of the latency increase or whatever, going with the 4080 to do native rendering or at least no frame gen implementation, going to the 4080 is a huge difference. Now, going to the low settings with the 4070 versus 4080, 52 FPS on average for the 4070, in the low 70s, 71 FPS over here for the 4080. That's a huge improvement for the 4080. Again, the 1% lows of 50 matching the average of the 4070's main average FPS, which is just such a huge, it's quite humorous to me. How different this is. All right, so 42 FPS on average here for the 4070, 63 before we're zoomed in. A 50% increase in FPS going with the 4080 with the i9. Again, our 1% low, higher than the average FPS of the 4070. Over 100 FPS when zoomed in on a spaceship with the 4080, only about 60 FPS when zoomed in on the spaceship with the 4070. It's quite dramatic, the difference when you're jumping between those two. Now, what about the 4080 versus the 4090? We got the MSI GE78 here with the 4080 versus the SCAR 16, 4090 with the i9, ultra settings, QHD 100% render resolution, 51 FPS coming out here for the GE78, 54 FPS for the 4090. I believe it eventually averages up towards the 55 range. Yeah, so basically only a 4 to 5 FPS difference or about a 10% increase in performance with the 4090 versus the 4080. So it's not bad. Now, I want to also point out that we have quite a bit more wattage going through the SCAR 16's CPU versus the GE78's CPU. Only 75 watts here. And if you were to watch this regularly, you'll see that the wattage in the SCAR 16 is quite a bit higher. We are in manual mode with the SCAR 16, letting that power limit just push higher. This is, I think, the reason why our 1% low is so much better on the SCAR 16. Yeah, because otherwise I would have expected the GE78 1% low to be very similar because they have the exact same processor in both of these laptops. So that just shows to show you how even if you have the same processor, if the manufacturer tunes it quite a bit differently, your 1% lows will be dramatically affected if your power limit is that much lower. Next up, we have the 4080 versus 4090 on low settings, FSR 100% QHD plus again. 71 FPS right here on low settings, 76, 77 FPS on average for the SCAR 16. So about, again, like an 8 to 10% increase in performance on low settings. Really not a big difference between a 4080 and a 4090, just in general and also in this game. Now, the 4080 versus 4090 in space, before we zoom in, 63 FPS here, 72 FPS on the 4090. So a little bit of a gap there, but when you zoom in, both of these are getting close to 100, if not over 100 FPS when zoomed in on a spaceship. And this is with no DLSS or frame gen. So in space, this game actually works pretty dang well. And I think it's fairly well optimized, especially considering we're at 100% render resolution with no upscaling. Now this is a 4-way split screen benchmark right here. 72 FPS on the 4090, 63 on the GE78, 35 on the 4060 for the Zephyrus G14, and 43 for the 4070. So this really shows you that the 4090 literally doing more than double the FPS of a 4060 at the same resolution and settings. This, of course, is ultra settings, 2560 by 1600. So if you want to do QHD gaming in the latest titles, going for the 4080 is probably my bigger recommendation, or a 4090 if you can get it on the right sale. Obviously, if you're willing to play with lower settings, then going to the 4060 is very viable, especially if you're willing to play on a lower resolution and have lower settings. Then it's going to be very future-proof. So here we are on the ground now, the 4090 doing 54, 55 FPS, the 4080 doing 51 FPS, the 4070 doing 35 FPS, the 4060 doing 30 FPS, and of course our 1% lows also doing much better here on the Scar 16 versus the GE78 and the Nitro 16 as well. On ground is much more demanding than when you're in space. Especially if you're in any area with a lot of NPCs, especially the main hub cities. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Aquila is one of the cities that's very demanding. And then New Atlantis, there we go. I always think it's New Visions or something, but it's New Atlantis. New Atlantis and Aquila being the two most demanding cities. Now, the piece de resistance, the thing you've been waiting for, DLSS 3 with frame gen support. Ultra settings, RTX 4060. This is the G14 tested 2 times in a row. 100% render resolution versus 100% render resolution. So basically, no upscaling here, just adding frame gen support into the mix. 29, 30, 30 FPS here on the G14 and 50 FPS with frame gen. And look at our 1% lows, more importantly, 39 FPS. Now, when you're doing this low of FPS with frame gen, though, it does add a lot of latency, and I definitely noticed it when I was playing the game, a bit more than you normally would. Made it a little harder to aim, though it was so much more fluid, though, it was still probably totally worth it, in my opinion, to play with frame gen. Now, we do have another example of frame gen. If you go down to ultra settings with 75% FSR and 50% DLSS. So this, in my opinion, is very comparable visually. 34 FPS over here with FSR at 75%. DLSS with frame gen at 50% render resolution. It still looks, I think, just as good as 75% FSR, but look at our FPS, 65 FPS and 49 for our 1% lows. Frame gen just boosting our 1% low performance out the wazoo on the same laptop. This benchmark now looks like the benchmark that we were getting on the Scar 16, but it's on the 4060. So it's DLSS 3, basically upgrading your 4060 to a 4090 with a little bit of latency input lag. Now, I believe we do I have low settings in here tested as well? Yeah, so low settings. Now this is really where it looks a lot better and plays much better, because when you have a higher frame rate with frame gen, you really are going to get a lot better experience, because a higher frame rate is going to be less latency with all those in-between frames being shoved in between the real frames. So with the frame gen on low settings, on low settings over here, the Zephyrus G14 was averaging around 42 FPS. This average is a bit off because I looked at the menu for a moment, but it's about 42 average FPS on low settings. You can see it right here, versus 92 FPS with DLSS with frame gen. Absolutely insane. I mean, absolutely insane. So it's like 100% render resolution with FSR versus 50% render resolution with DLSS with the frame gen. I mainly put this in to show you what does QHD Plus look like with DLSS 3 support enabled, with frame gen support enabled, 92 FPS with a 4060. So what does this translate to for an RTX 4090 laptop? Well, I went ahead and tested my Blade 18. I did capture the video on the system, so know that I'm recording while at the same time recording this benchmark. So it is going to actually perform a little bit better without visually recording this. 60 FPS here with the 4090 with ultra default settings, 75% render resolution on both FSR, and DLSS. Now, we're doing 60 FPS, 42 for our 1% low with the Blade 18. That's pretty good. That's definitely playable. But look at this. Ultra settings, 95 FPS, 71 for our 1% lows. When I switched to DLSS 3 frame gen support on Starfield, it is like so much smoother. So how do you get this mod installed? First of all, you're going to go to the link in the description and go over to Starfield frame generation mod. And then you'll go there, you'll hit the manual download button. You'll just download that file, and then you're going to extract it into your Starfield folder. So what I do here is I went ahead and go to my Starfield folder here, and then I copy the URL by clicking there. That highlights the text. I copy that and I paste that in here. I extract it, and then you just paste it in there. Now I've already put it in there, so it's warning me that I'm going to overwrite some files here. Now, once you've extracted your FrameGen mod support into the Starfield subfolder, you need to download 2 additional files, which are going to be found linked in the Starfield FrameGen website. They are the DLSS 3.0 and DLSS 3.5 with FrameGen support DLLs. And then once you have those, you're going to copy those into your streamline folder that the mod put into your Starfield. So there it is right there. And there's the 2 files already copied in. I went ahead and copied them already. But basically, once you do that, you can go ahead and run Starfield and it'll automatically switch to using DLSS with FrameGen support instead of FSR2. It literally took me, I don't know, 3 minutes to download and install this and read the instructions. It is incredibly simple, and it literally almost 50% plus boost to FPS with a better visual clarity as well compared to FSR at the same render resolution. So can I recommend the DLSS mod? Absolutely right now, as long as it's not causing you to crash, then it's gonna be totally worth it. It did not crash for me in my testing, but I have not played super lot of hours yet with DLSS FrameGen enabled. Now there is another mod that you can download, which is just DLSS. If you have an RTX 2000, 3000 GPU, you can use those. That mod to run DLSS. It's a little bit different install, and I did do an overview tutorial on how to install that DLSS mod as well in one of my recent live streams in my Starfield gameplay review. If you want to check that out, there will be a link in the description, or check out my recent live stream history if you want to hear my opinion after beating Starfield the game. I definitely enjoyed it, and I can definitely recommend it if you're a sci-fi nerd like me. Again, big shout out and thank you to Best Buy sponsoring this episode. Link in the description if you want to check out the Zephyrus G14 or the Elgato Stream Deck. I'll see you in the next one. Brandon out.